moseying to our seats. And we'll start with our reading here in just a moment. Oh, some more last minute hugs are happening in the back there. That's awesome. So we do get a chance to visit at the end of the service. Yeah, I know. At the end of the service, there's going to be a potluck. There is so much food back there, you guys. So please, I encourage you that if you don't have to rush off, please stay and enjoy some of the food that's been brought as we continue to celebrate this Easter Sunday and continue to visit. I like that we like each other. I like that we actually want to talk and greet each other, and we're laughing together and we're happy to see each other. I think that's a wonderful thing, and it's a blessing, and I'm glad we get to continue to do that after the service as well. So I encourage you that if you are going to be able to stay, please do stay for the meal following the service. For right now, we are going to spend a few minutes reading a text and thinking about what it might mean for us this morning. And we are going to go ahead and just do that for a few minutes, and then we're going to call Chris and Corey and Janetta back up, and then we're going to close with some more singing and more response with worship back to God in light of what it means that He has risen today. First, I'm going to read from John chapter 20, and I invite you to listen as we read this account of what happened after Jesus rose again. So in John chapter 20, starting in verse 19, this is what it says. It was evening of the first day of the week. The followers had gathered together with the doors locked because they were afraid of the Jews. Jesus came and stood among them. He said, "May you have peace." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. When the followers saw the Lord, they were filled with joy. Then Jesus said to them, "May you have peace. As the Father has sent me, I also am sending you." When Jesus had said this, he breathed on them. He said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you say that people are free of their sins, they are free of them. If you say that people are not free of sins, they still have them." Thomas was not with them when Jesus came. He was one of the 12 followers, and he was called the Twin. The other followers told him, "We have seen the Lord." And he said to them, "I will not believe until I see the marks made by the nails in his hands. I will not believe until I put my finger in the marks of the nails. I will not believe until I put my hand into his side." 8 days later, the followers were again inside a house. Thomas was with them. The doors were locked. Jesus came and stood among them, and he said, "May you have peace." He said to Thomas, "Put your finger into my hands. Put your hand into my side. Do not doubt, believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you believe. Those are happy who have never seen me and yet believe." Jesus did many other powerful works in front of his followers. They are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. When you put your trust in him, you will have the life that lasts forever through his name. This is the Holy Scripture that we read this morning. Randy, is it okay if I just ask if you helped Hero and Jaira if the kids want to go to another space? Thank you. They're welcome in here, just to let them know where the other spaces are. So today we are here and we gather together on Easter to celebrate the miracle of Jesus' resurrection. And it's the final miracle that we're going to talk about in this series that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. There is a reason that these miracles matter. There's a reason they've been written down, and for us to study them and to think about them and to understand why he did them. They were not only necessary at that time, but they matter to us, and it matters that we remember them as well. Miracles were like credentials for Jesus. They were proof that Jesus was who he said he was. And I think we can kind of understand that. We use so many different forms of validation to say, this is who I am, and I have proof to back it up. We use things like identification cards. Some things are pretty elaborate, like passports or birth certificates, but we use them even for things like Costco memberships. We have things that we use to signify this is who I say I am, and I have proof, I have evidence to back it up. We have these evidence of these things to say, this is my name, this is my family, this is where I was born, this is what I have done. Because we also have these other things to back us up. We go ahead and we have these credentials. And credentials are a way of saying the things I have done that are associated with my name and my identifying credentials do in fact belong to me. I have done them. And we use lots of these things for all sorts of things. We use diplomas, certificates, records of completion, certificates. We use all of these different things to say, yes, I am able to do these things. I have completed the training. I have the know-how. I have done what is required to say I can do this. But Jesus didn't have any of that. He didn't have a birth certificate. He didn't have a driver's license card to show this is who I am. He didn't have something to be able to show I am who I say I am. And he didn't have a letter of validation. He didn't have a diploma. He didn't have a certificate to say, yep, I'm the Son of God. This piece of paper right here shows it and proves it. Instead, he had to have something else to give validation, to show and to prove in some other way that he was indeed the Son of God. And so he performed miracles, things only God could have done. And he performed enough miracles and in front of enough people that he did provide sufficient evidence to show who he was. Several times people challenged him on this. They asked for miracles on demand. But Jesus made it clear this was not a form of entertainment, and he was not at the mercy of individuals who simply had a desire of proof. He was not there to persuade anybody, but he was there and he did show, he did give sufficient evidence. And then he left it up to everyone else to decide, either believe or don't. All of these miracles that he did led up to this miracle that we talk about today, to his resurrection, the thing that we celebrate. He is risen today. But it's not the only miracle that we celebrate today. And before I get into what that other miracle is, I want to take a second to talk about this passage this morning. This passage from John is the account where Thomas earns his more famous name, the doubting Thomas name. In here it talks about he's the twin, but when we talk about Thomas, we talk about doubting Thomas. And I'm not sure if that is entirely fair. After all, I kind of get it. If I was sitting with some of my friends and we have just experienced this truly traumatizing event, we've gone through this horrible ordeal where somebody that we cared about, our friend, somebody we were following, somebody that we were trusting, somebody that we put all of our hopes in, he was violently killed. It was a terrible event. And if I was sitting around with them after this happened, and they all came to me and they said, he came back, we've seen him, I would go, that's a little bizarre. That's perhaps just a little too far-fetched for me to really believe. I don't know that I could believe that after this thing that I saw happen to him, how he was violently crucified, he's just up and walking about 3 days later as if nothing had happened. I think I would be skeptical too. I think I would have some questions. And this is where I'm not sure that we're always entirely fair with this passage. Unfortunately, I have heard this passage used to suggest that we shouldn't ask questions, that we shouldn't have a hint of doubt or concern in our lives, that we are to somehow have this absolute assuredness of our understanding, that there is no wavering, and that the strength of our faith can be measured in the strength of our certainty. That's not only untrue, but I think it can lead to a weaker faith, a weaker trust in the truth of who God is and what he does. I think it's good for us to ask questions. I think it's good for us to acknowledge when things sound bizarre. I think it's good that we can probe our understanding and that we can wrestle in those spaces of questioning and go, well, what if it didn't happen the way that we thought it had happened? There's a book that I read in college, and I still reference it from time to time, and it's called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And the opening sentence to that book is, the scandal of the evangelical mind is that there isn't one. It's a memorable line, not just because it's kind of witty, but because there is truth to it. Unfortunately, if we have this faith that rests in certainty alone, if we have taught ourselves to stop asking questions, to stop sitting comfortably with mystery, to stop thinking deeply, and to stop sitting in those spaces of admitting when things sound absurd, if we stop ourselves and we avoid open discussion when there is a lack of consensus, then we have turned our faith in God into faith in certainty, and we've lost the thread. Faith that does not lead us to thirst for more because we realize how little we understand. If we have a faith that doesn't grow or change or develop, if we have a faith that says certain questions are off limits, well then I'm not really sure we could describe that as a healthy faith. Healthy faith lives in a way that it grows and it thrives and it exercises and it becomes more about the question than about finding pat answers. It's not about a straw man argument. Faith grows only when it is tested, and it rests in a God who is beyond our mastery of knowledge. So while I do not think it's fair if we were to use this passage to lead us away from critical thinking, I also think this is still an example of Thomas, who wasn't just asking a question. He wasn't just thinking deeply about it. He was not merely trying to be a critical thinker. This was Thomas being cynical. This is not an example for us to follow if we're wanting to seek out a deep faith. This is not Thomas who is just being wise and shrewd to question things. Because the fact is that Thomas wasn't only asking one question. He was, in fact, only kind of asking one part of one question. This is Thomas being cynical. He is not merely doubting. He's only willing to ask and consider certain possibilities. Because there is a significant difference between asking questions and only asking certain questions. Here Thomas only asks, and perhaps he's asking himself, because it is phrased more of a statement. It's more of a declaration he makes to the disciples. And so that's even more evidence that he maybe wasn't even asking the questions, at least not honestly. But he asks himself, what if it didn't happen that way? What if they're mistaken? What if it's wrong? What if Jesus didn't rise? And then he stops there. And that's where he stays. He's not seeking to understand this deeply or to give critical thought to what happened. He's not looking to test his trust and faith in the person he has trusted for the last 3 years. He asks the questions, well, what if it didn't happen? And then he stops. Thomas had done that. He had spent 3 years traveling with Jesus. He saw the things Jesus did. He was a witness to the miracles that were the credentials and the validation that Jesus was who he said he was. He listened to Jesus, not only to his teachings, but also to the prophetic claims that Jesus would die and rise again. And then he was sitting there with his friends. He was surrounded by the many people he trusted, people he had no reason to doubt, and they claimed that Jesus had risen. Thomas was not cynical or doubtful. He wasn't derided later by Christ that somehow he shouldn't have had this natural inclination to go, wait a second, this doesn't fit. It wasn't wrong for him to say, what if it didn't happen? His mistake was not going to the next step of, but what if it did? This, I think, is a key question that we all must face at some point. It's fine to ask what if it didn't really happen, but it would be false and cowardly to stop there and never consider the rest of the question. But what if it did? What if, and we do have many valid reasons to think that it did, what if Jesus really did come to earth as the Son of God? What if he really, as God himself, came and ministered and died for us and performed that miracle of taking our sins and dying in our place and then transforming that sin into something wonderful and life-giving and then offering it back to us after he had defeated death? Once he had risen, once he had that resurrection and his return to life, he offered it back to us as something new. What does that change if he really did do this? Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, made this famous quote, and he was French, so he said this in French, but I don't know French, so I'm going to give you the English translation of his quote. And he says, "If I believe in God and life after death, and you do not, and there is no God, we both lose when we die. However, if there is a God, you still lose and I gain everything. He's bringing this point home that if we were to ask just the one question, if God is really God and really did all that he claimed to do, and I believe but you don't, what's really at risk? What's really at stake? What if he is real? What if Jesus really did come back and he's offering us eternal life? Then what? And I think that question, if we really go ahead and wrestle with that question, it's so much more than just hedging our bets, which is a lot of times what we've done with this Pascal reference, is we've turned it into let's just hedge our bets. Let's just go ahead and get some fire insurance. This is the difference of avoiding death and living a full life. If we were to live in this question of what if he really did do this? In Romans 10, it states that if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. I love Eugene Peterson's description of what it is that we are gaining in this process. It's not an avoidance of death, but it is life, life, and more life. I love that description. It's not just avoiding death. It is overflowing life. Life so full and complete that it's just more and more and more. If this is the case, if it is true, if it really did happen, then it does change everything. I love that in this passage this morning, Jesus didn't go, oh, well, too bad, Thomas, you missed out. You didn't believe when you heard about it, and you had reason to believe. You didn't trust it, so that's just tough. He didn't do that. Thomas had only asked one part of the question, and Jesus didn't go ahead and condemn him for that. Instead, Jesus met Thomas where he was at. He gave him reason to believe and trust. He gave him an actual interaction with him to show that it was true. We may never have a Thomas experience. We may never have that physical interaction with Jesus standing directly in front of us, offering for the proof there to be for us to see. I do think some people have that kind of experience. I've heard testimony of people who've had that kind of experience. I personally have never had that kind of experience. But I have had interactions with Jesus. I have an experience where he met me where I was at, and it's not just trusting a story I read in a book. Many of us won't have that personal interaction that Thomas had, but it doesn't mean that Jesus won't meet us where we are at, that we can't also bear witness to the miracles of what he still continues to do in our lives. We are the ones who Jesus was talking about when he talked to Thomas, and he said, those are happy who have never seen me yet believe. It doesn't mean that our faith is simply based on words we read, things that happened to other people. We're moved to trust and have faith in Jesus because of something we experience ourselves. It's good when we can listen to the testimonies of others, but when we listen to the testimonies of others, we listen to them talk about the interactions they had with Jesus, what they personally experienced with him. Faith comes not just because we listen to convincing arguments or because we feel obligated. Faith happens because of something real that we experience when we are willing to ask that question and truly consider, what if Jesus really did die for my sins and rise again from the grave? This is the other miracle we celebrate today. It's the miracle of a changed life. All of the miracles that we talked about over the last few weeks, up until Friday, actually, those were all about credentials. Those were all about Jesus giving evidence that he was who he said he was, including raising Lazarus from the dead. All of those miracles were giving proof and evidence. But the miracles that we talked about on Friday and that we talk about today, the miracle of resurrection, the miracle of the cross and the empty grave, is the miracle for us. It is the miracle that is still working in our lives. It's the miracle that is still working today. It's still healing. It's still bringing wholeness. To anyone who chooses to believe and trust in their heart and profess with their mouth, it is the miracle that is still happening today. And it happens in so much more than just hedging our bets, so much more than just fire insurance or salvation from hell. It is the change from when we ask ourselves, what if Jesus really did this? Because it's a question that grows and changes the more that we ask it. It's not just a one-time question. Perhaps that was at the beginning. Perhaps that's the first question they asked to get you into that space of initial faith. What if it's true? What if it's true? Because we've been told so many times that the smart question is to say, what if it didn't happen? And that's fair. Ask the question. But be brave enough to ask that second question. What if it is true? And then that question leads us to this belief, this beginning to say, perhaps there is something there. It leads us to being open to the opportunity of having an interaction with Jesus that is real, something that then we can base our faith on. But I think we need to continue asking ourselves this question, to continue in this space of celebrating and believing the truth of Easter with our entire lives, not just a portion of it. Because what more does it change if it is true? Sometimes we get into the space of complacency. It sets in, we've taken that initial step, but then we still have to ask ourselves this question. We still have to say, what if this is true? Because we start to hold back parts of our lives, not letting the result of this miracle touch absolutely everything, not to change everything. If Jesus defeated death, what else can he overcome? What is it that we fear? What is it that we are not truly trusting to God? What is it that we are living in a space of not listening and not believing that he can actually take care of it? What if we go ahead and we believe that, or we at least ask the question and wrestle? If we believe that God truly did this, that he died, but then he rose from the grave 3 days later, and he is still alive today. He's still active. He's still performing that miracle in our lives. He is still doing something here with us today. If we ask our question and we can sit in that space, we're still willing to ponder that question. What would it change if we say, what if he really did? That's what we are here to celebrate this miracle of not only Jesus' resurrection, but to celebrate the miracle of what it means for healing and change in our lives. When we ask that question, what if Jesus really did rise from the dead? Please join me in prayer. God, we are grateful that our faith is one of celebration. It is one of hope. It is one not of guilt and shame and burden. It is one of freedom and life and fullness, of hope beyond the things we see, hope beyond the things we feel at any given moment, God. We ask that we find the bravery to ask questions, ask all the questions, to challenge our faith, to challenge our